October 14th, 8:47 p.m. The suitcase hit the porch steps before she did. It landed on its side with a dull, graceless thud, the sound of a life being summarized into 32 pounds of clothing, documents, and whatever else could be grabbed in under 6 minutes. The zipper had caught on a blouse sleeve, and a strip of white cotton hung from the seam like a small, useless surrender flag. She came through the doorway a half-second later, not pushed, not shoved, guided by the geometry of a situation that no longer had room for her inside it. The door closed behind her. Not a slam, a click, the flat, mechanical sound of a deadbolt turning into position. Final the way paperwork is final, the way signatures are final, the way a man who has already made his decision sounds when there is nothing left in him to argue with. On the porch, the one she had stripped and restained 2 summers ago, the one with joists she had replaced with her own hands, a pregnant woman stood holding one palm against her stomach and the other against open air. Inside the house, the man who had locked that door pressed his forehead against the hallway wall and breathed in shallow, fractured pulls. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Along the stairwell, framed photographs held still, a wedding, a first Thanksgiving, a blurry Polaroid from the county fair, each one wearing the dumb patience of objects that don't know they've become relics. He believed what he'd been told, every syllable, and because he believed it, he had looked at the woman carrying his child and seen someone he didn't recognize. Outside, the October air settled against her skin. She didn't cry. She reached down, righted the suitcase, and started walking toward the only streetlight still functioning on Harmon Lane. Her reflection stretched long and wrong across the wet pavement, distorted, unfamiliar, and she thought absurdly, involuntarily, about the first time he had ever said her name out loud. He'd gotten it wrong. Of course he had. Everyone did. Now, before we go forward, we need to go back, because the lock on that door didn't turn tonight. It was built years ago, tumblers set one, by hands that looked like friendship and sounded like concern. And the woman walking toward that streetlight? She'd survived worse than October. She'd survived being underestimated her entire life. What she hadn't survived, what nobody prepares you for, is the specific violence of being erased by the person who once learned your name like it was something sacred. This is how that name was learned, and this is how it was forgotten. 4 years earlier, the town of Grayfield, Pennsylvania, occupied the stretch of earth between 2 landmarks nobody visited on purpose, a decommissioned rail yard to the north and a reservoir to the south that hadn't been safe for swimming since 1986. The main street had a diner, a pharmacy, a bar called Kessler's that had survived 3 recessions on draft beer and stubbornness, and the kind of quiet that ambitious people mistook for peace on their way to somewhere else. Grayfield didn't produce dreamers. It produced people who stayed, and people who left and came back quieter than when they'd gone. Ren Callister was the second kind, 31 years old, 7 years in Philadelphia behind him, first a degree in applied mathematics, then a consulting firm that had valued his ability to find patterns in data sets and rewarded him with fluorescent-lit offices, a salary that looked impressive until you subtracted rent, and the slow, compounding fatigue of performing competence 60 hours a week for people who didn't know his name. The firm laid off its entire analytics division on a Wednesday in March. Ren found out by email. He read it on his phone while standing in line at a coffee shop, and the barista asked him if he was okay, and he said yes, because that was faster than explaining that his backup plan had just revealed it didn't have a backup plan. He came back to Grayfield because his mother's house needed selling. She'd been dead 14 months. The estate, if you could call a 3-bedroom colonial with a leaking roof and a second mortgage an estate, was tangled in debts that his sister wouldn't touch, and his brother didn't acknowledge, and his father had forfeited any right to comment on, when he'd walked out 20 years earlier. So Ren drove home in a leased Honda with a trunk full of clothes he'd need to return the dry cleaning hangers for, and a weariness that sat behind his eyes like a permanent tenant. He needed caulk. That was the beginning of everything. Fontaine's Hardware sat on the corner of Miller Street and Broad, in a 2-story brick building with a hand-painted sign that had been fading in the same direction since 1974. Everyone in Grayfield still called it by the dead man's name, the way they called the reservoir Haldeman's Lake, even though Haldeman had been gone for 40 years. The store smelled like mineral spirits and cut pine, and the particular staleness of a space that has been circulating the same air through the same aisles for decades. Odessa Fontaine was behind the counter when Ren walked in. She was 28. She had a bachelor's degree in structural engineering from Penn State that she'd never used professionally, a business she'd inherited the way some people inherit chronic conditions, not by choice but by proximity and obligation. And the particular composure of a woman who had buried her father at 26 and kept his doors open every day since, not out of sentiment, but because 14 employees depended on those doors and sentiment didn't cover payroll. She didn't look up when the bell above the entrance chimed. "I'm looking for something waterproof," Wren said, standing in the sealant aisle with the posture of a man who had never sealed anything in his life. "For what surface?" She was marking inventory on a clipboard, pen moving in short, efficient strokes. "Bathtub, upstairs, the grouts disintegrated. Silicone-based, aisle 3, top shelf. Red cap, not the blue is acrylic. It'll start peeling inside 6 months." He disappeared down the aisle, came back holding the blue one. She looked at it. Then, at him. He had the kind of face that suggested his 20s had been better structured than his 30s. Brown eyes set deep, a jaw that still held shape under the fatigue, the overall appearance of a good coat that had spent too many seasons outside without maintenance. "Red cap," she said. This was closer. Closer isn't waterproof. He smiled. It changed his entire face, cracked something open in it, the way light moves through a door left ajar. "Fair point, Odessa." He'd read her name tag, and he'd pronounced it Odessa, like the city in Texas, like a place on a map you drive through without stopping. "It's Odessa," she corrected. No irritation, just precision. The same voice she used to explain the difference between acrylic and silicone. "Like the one in Ukraine. My grandmother was from there." "Odessa," he repeated. Slower this time. Careful. Like he was holding the word in his mouth to learn its weight before setting it down. "That's a name you have to earn the right to say correctly." She almost smiled. The corner of her mouth moved, and then she caught it. "Go get the red cap." He did. He came back the next day for wood glue he didn't need, stood in the adhesive section for 9 minutes, reading labels he had no use for, before buying a tube of construction-grade bonding agent and asking Odessa whether it worked on ceramic. "Depends on the ceramic," she said without looking up. "And you don't have a ceramic project." "How do you know?" "Because you're holding the tube like you've never opened one." The day after that, he came in for a Phillips head screwdriver he already owned. The day after that, he stood in the doorway, didn't cross the threshold, didn't browse, and said, "I don't actually need anything, I just wanted to say your name right." Odessa. He said it the way you'd say a word in a language you were learning to speak, deliberate, slightly reverent, aware of its history. Like a small private promise being made in public. Something behind her sternum shifted. Not the dramatic freefall of infatuation, not the cinematic collapse. Something quieter. A door she hadn't known was locked, clicking open without announcement. She handed him a receipt for a purchase he hadn't made. "Come back when you actually need something, Wren." He came back the following Saturday, not to the store but to his mother's house, where a listing agent had just told him the foundation was in worse shape than the roof. He was standing on the front porch doing the math on repairs he couldn't afford, when a pickup truck pulled into the driveway, and Odessa Fontaine stepped out uninvited, wearing work boots and carrying a flashlight. She didn't knock. She walked straight to the porch railing, crouched, and aimed the beam underneath the structure. "Your joists are rotting," she said. "Whoever poured the footer didn't grade the drainage properly. You've got standing moisture under here that's been eating the wood for years. How much to fix it? If you hire someone, $8,000. If you let me show you how, $400 in lumber and a weekend." That Saturday they were on their hands and knees in the crawl space, pulling out softened wood that came apart in wet, fibrous strips and fitting new joists into the gaps. She was precise where he was approximate, patient where he was frustrated. She explained load-bearing principles the way certain people talk about music, with genuine reverence for invisible structure, for the unseen framework that holds everything visible in place. "Treated pine," she said, running her hand along a fresh beam. "Costs more up front, lasts 3 times as long. Most people go cheap and replace it twice. That's not saving, that's just paying the same price slower." Wren lay on his back in the crawl space, sawdust in his hair, her voice above him explaining why moisture barriers mattered more than aesthetics, and he thought, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the slow certainty of something settling into place. I could listen to this woman explain how things hold together for the rest of my life and never once lose interest. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a foundation being laid, the kind of knowing that doesn't announce itself with volume or spectacle, It just moves into the structure quietly, bears weight, and stays. What Ren didn't know yet, what he wouldn't know for 3 more years, was that someone else had already noticed this story taking shape. Someone who stood close enough to watch every beam go into place, and who had been quietly calculating, with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting, exactly how much weight the structure could bear before it broke. If you're already feeling where this is heading, subscribe now, because this story is about to shift beneath your feet. 3 years earlier, they didn't fall in love the way stories promise people fall in love. There was no single crystallizing moment, no grand gesture that cracked the sky open. It accumulated, the way sediment gathers at the bottom of a river, grain by grain, so gradually that you don't notice the current has changed direction until the day you look up and realize you've been flowing somewhere new for months. It started with shoulders. Odessa carried stress in her shoulders. Ren noticed it the second week he started coming to the store, the way they crept upward, inch by inch, whenever the delivery schedule fell behind, or a supplier shorted an order, or the register jammed during a Saturday rush. By 3 o'clock on any given weekday, her shoulders sat so high they were practically touching her earlobes, and she moved through the aisles with the rigid efficiency of someone holding the entire building together through willpower and vertebrae alone. He didn't ask permission. He just started showing up. First, it was weekends. He reorganized the electrical aisle, which hadn't been properly sorted since her father's death and had devolved into a graveyard of mismatched breaker boxes and tangled extension cords. Then he fixed the stockroom door, the one that had been sticking for 2 years, the one every employee had learned to shoulder check on entry instead of reporting. He replaced the hinges, planed the bottom edge, and rehung it in an afternoon. Then he learned to cut keys. Badly, at first. His first dozen attempts produced blanks that wouldn't turn in any lock known to man. But he kept at it, adjusting his pressure on the machine, learning the difference between a slug and a quickset by feel, and within a month he was competent. Within 2 months he was good. Within 3, Odessa stopped, double-checking his work, and that was the highest compliment she knew how to give. Not praise, not acknowledgement, just the quiet withdrawal of supervision, the structural engineer's version of trust. In return, she taught him how buildings work, not metaphorically, literally. On evenings after the store closed, sitting on the tailgate of her truck with takeout containers balanced between them, she'd explain the principles she'd spent 4 years studying and never had the chance to practice. How a header beam distributes weight above a window, how a footer anchors a wall to the earth beneath it, how every visible surface, every painted wall, every tile floor, every ceiling someone looked up at without thinking, depended entirely on something invisible underneath it. People only notice the structure when it fails, she told him once, scraping the last of a container of lo mein. Nobody walks into a house and says, "What beautiful joists." They say, "What beautiful floors." But take the joists out and see what happens to the floors. Ren looked at her, grease on her thumb, chopsticks in her left hand because she was one of those rare left-handed people who never switched, and understood that she wasn't just talking about buildings. She was describing herself, the woman who held everything up and was noticed only when something went wrong. He decided, sitting on that tailgate, that he was going to be the person who noticed before things went wrong. Not because she needed saving, she had never, not once, needed saving, but because the kind of woman who holds up the world deserves to know that at least one person sees the weight. They got married the following spring in the backyard of the house on Harmon Lane, the one they'd repaired together, the one with the new porch joists and the regraded drainage, and the front door Odessa had painted sage green because she said it was the color of something growing. 26 guests. No DJ. A borrowed speaker playing a playlist they'd argued over for 2 weeks, her preference for old Motown against his inexplicable loyalty to 90s folk rock. They compromised the way they compromised on everything. She won. Odessa wore her grandmother's ring, resized to fit her finger by a jeweler in Allentown who charged $40 and told her, unsolicited, that Ukrainian gold held up better than most. Ren read his vows from the back of a Fontaine's hardware receipt, the paper creased, the ink slightly smeared, the margins filled with crossed-out lines where he'd revised himself into honesty. He said he'd chosen that paper because it felt true, because the most important moments of their relationship had happened inside that store, or underneath a porch, or in the bed of a pickup truck eating takeout, and he wanted the vows to live on something that came from the same world. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together very hard and looked at him with an expression that anyone else would have called serious, but that Ren understood was the face Odessa Fontaine made when she was feeling something too large to let out safely in front of 26 people. Perry Barlow stood beside the groom, holding the rings. He was smiling. Of course he was. Perry always smiled. It was his default setting, the expression he wore the way other men wore cologne. Broad-shouldered, brown-haired, dependable in the way that a municipal bus schedule is dependable, present at predictable intervals, never exciting, never late. He coached youth baseball on Saturdays. He remembered birthdays. He was the kind of man other men described as solid and women described as sweet, and both words functioned as the same thing, a wall, a way of saying he was near enough to be seen, but never quite near enough to be reached. He handed the rings to Wren at the appointed moment. He delivered his best man's toast with warmth and practiced humor. He shook Odessa's hand, then pulled her into a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time, not short enough to seem cold, not long enough to seem like anything other than what it appeared to be. But when the borrowed speaker played the first song and Wren pulled Odessa onto the grass and they danced in the uncoordinated, slightly embarrassed way of two people who had never once danced together, Perry Barlow stood near the fence with a glass of champagne and watched. He watched the way a man watches the last departure pulling away from the platform, not with fury, not with bitterness, but with the slow, settling heaviness of someone who understands, finally and without appeal, that he will never arrive where he intended to go. Nobody noticed. Nobody was supposed to. That was the thing about Perry. He had spent his entire life being solid and sweet and overlooked, and he had learned with the patience of long practice to make his presence feel like furniture. Ordinary, expected, easy to forget was even in the room. The strongest marriages are not built on passion alone. They are built on the daily decision to keep showing up for labor that no one applauds, the quiet, invisible, load-bearing work of two people choosing each other in the ordinary hours. But every foundation, no matter how carefully laid, carries a limit stamped somewhere in its design, a threshold of pressure it was never engineered to hold. And sometimes the weight that breaks it doesn't come from above. It comes from inside the room, from the person standing closest, smiling, holding the rings. October 14th, 6:14 p.m. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. That's all it takes to end a marriage. Not years of erosion, not months of distance. 11 minutes from a voice Wren Callister had trusted since he was 17 years old, a voice that carried the careful, thick-throated anguish of a man who had been rehearsing. His grief the way actors rehearse a death scene, privately and repeatedly, until every pause sounded involuntary and every hesitation landed like reluctance instead of calculation. I wasn't going to say anything. That was how Perry Barlow opened. 5 words designed to do exactly one thing, establish himself as a man burdened by information he never wanted to carry. I've been going back and forth on this for weeks, Wren. I didn't sleep last night, but you're my best friend and I can't just sit on this. Wren was standing in the kitchen when he answered. He'd been pulling plates from the cabinet for dinner. Odessa was upstairs, resting. Her feet had been swelling in the afternoons, and the doctors said to elevate them when she could. The house was warm. The furnace was running. Everything was ordinary. What are you talking about? Wren said. Perry exhaled. Long. Controlled. The exhale of a man who wants you to hear the weight he's carrying before he transfers it to your shoulders. 2 months ago, the clinic on Broad Street, the prenatal place, I was picking up a prescription at the pharmacy next door, and I saw her, Wren Odessa. She was with someone, a man, and they were, I don't know how to say this. Say it. They were close, too close, his arm around her. She was leaning into him. It didn't look like nothing, Wren. Silence. The plate in Wren's hand was still suspended between the cabinet and the counter, hovering in the air the way a held breath hovers in the chest. And I started thinking about the timeline, Perry continued. His voice dropped, quieter now, confessional, intimate. The voice of a man sharing something painful rather than planting something lethal. You were in Columbus for 3 weeks in April, 3 full weeks, and she's, 11 weeks along? The math, Wren. I keep running the math and it doesn't add up. The plate reached the counter. Wren's hand stayed on it. His knuckles whitened. Here's what made Perry Barlow's lie so effective. He didn't fabricate a name. He didn't invent a dramatic affair with details that could be checked, verified, and dismantled. He did something far more precise. He took a real event, Odessa's clinic visit, which had actually happened, and he placed it inside a frame that turned ordinary into suspicious. He didn't create a false narrative. He contaminated a true one. He planted a single seed of doubt in soil he knew was already fertile, and then he stepped back and let Wren's own fear do the growing. Perry Barlow didn't need to invent a villain. He just needed Wren to become his own. And if you think you already know how this ends, stay with me, because the damage is just getting started. Because Perry understood something about Ren Callister that Ren himself had never fully articulated, something Perry had absorbed over 16 years of friendship through every late night conversation and every bourbon-loosened confession and every unguarded admission that slipped out at 2 in the morning when the defenses were down and the truth came forward wearing no disguise. Ren Callister had grown up watching his father leave. Not once, not in a single definitive exit that could be mourned and processed and filed away. Gerald Callister left in stages, the way a tide pulls back from shore. So gradually that by the time you notice the water's gone, you can't remember the exact moment it started retreating. First, he left emotionally. The bedtime stories stopped when Ren was 6. The weekend catch in the backyard stopped at 7. By 8, Gerald occupied the house the way a piece of furniture occupies a room, physically present, functionally absent, taking up space without filling it. Then he left physically. Business trips that stretched from 3 days to 5 to 10. A weekend visit to a friend in Baltimore that lasted a month. The car pulling out of the driveway became such a routine event that Ren stopped going to the window to watch it leave. He was 9. Then he left legally. Papers signed. Custody arranged. A child support check that arrived on the 15th of every month with the mechanical regularity of a utility bill. Impersonal, automatic. The financial equivalent of a man saying, "I acknowledge your existence," without once saying, "I'm sorry," or "I miss you," or "this wasn't your fault." By 12, Ren had learned the lesson his father's departure had been teaching in installments. Love is a temporary arrangement. Trust is the setup, and the people who stay are simply the ones who haven't located the exit yet. He carried that lesson into every relationship he'd ever had. Carried it quietly, the way people carry chronic pain, not always visible, not always active, but always there, always shaping the way he moved through the world. Every act of closeness came with a flinch he'd learned to hide. Every declaration of commitment came with an internal countdown he couldn't turn off. And somewhere behind every kiss, every promise, every morning he woke up beside someone who was still there. A voice in the back of his skull whispered, "Not yet." But soon, Odessa had quieted that voice. Not silenced it, nothing silences it entirely, but muted it to a frequency he could almost ignore. 3 years of her showing up. 3 years of her hands on lumber, and her voice explaining foundations, and her presence in the bed beside him every single morning, constant as a load-bearing wall. But Perry had sat beside Ren through every confession. Every night when the bourbon came out, and the defenses went down, and Ren admitted, in the raw language of a man talking to his oldest friend, that he didn't know how to trust completely, that he was always waiting, that some part of him expected Odessa to reveal, eventually, that she'd been halfway out the door the entire time. Perry knew the blueprints of Ren's fear the way Odessa knew the blueprints of a house. He knew where the load-bearing walls were. He knew which beam, if removed, would bring the entire structure down. And on October 14th at 6:14 p.m., he reached in and pulled it. 2 months earlier, August, the clinic on Broad Street. Here is what actually happened. Odessa's car had been in the shop since Monday, a transmission issue that the mechanic kept promising would be resolved by tomorrow, in the way mechanics use the word tomorrow, meaning sometime between now and the eventual heat death of the universe. Her prenatal appointment was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. It included the first ultrasound. She would hear the heartbeat for the first time. She didn't want to reschedule. She didn't want to wait. Nico Reyes answered on the first ring. He was 63 years old. He had been her father's business partner for 11 years, and after her father's death he had appointed himself an unofficial, unpaid, entirely self-authorized guardian of Odessa's well-being. He had a wife named Bertia, who could not keep a secret if you welded her mouth shut. He had 4 grandchildren. He had a bad knee that turned stairs into negotiations and uneven pavement into a liability. He drove her to the clinic in his 15-year-old Buick, parked crookedly in the lot, and walked beside her to the entrance. The pavement was cracked. His knee buckled on a raised seam, and Odessa caught his arm, steadied him the way she'd steadied him 100 times before, the way you hold someone who helped raise you when the ground won't cooperate with their body. That was what Perry Barlow saw from the pharmacy parking lot next door, a young woman holding an older man's arm. And in that ordinary image, that small, unremarkable act of care between 2 people connected by decades of family and loss, Perry saw the raw material for something he could reshape into a weapon. Inside the clinic, Odessa lay on the exam table and watched the screen. The image was grainy, black and white, the resolution of something filmed underwater. But the heartbeat was clear, fast and certain and alive. Nico sat in the chair beside her and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Sounds like your father's laugh," he said. Quick, impatient, couldn't wait to get to the next thing. That night, Odessa called Ren in Columbus. She told him about the heartbeat, how fast it was, how it filled the room. She told him about the grainy image, about the technician pointing to a shape that looked like a comma with ambitions. She told him Nico had cried. Ren said, "I wish I'd been there." She said, "Next time, I promise." That conversation, plain, warm, full of the ordinary tenderness of two people building something together across the inconvenience of distance, was the truth. It lived in Ren's memory for 2 months, uncontaminated. A clean thing. A good thing. Until Perry's phone call reached backward across those 2 months and rearranged every word of it. The heartbeat became a detail she'd shared to cover her tracks. Nico's tears became a story she'd invented for texture. Next time, I promise, became the reassurance of a woman managing a secret. That is what a lie does. It doesn't just construct a false version of events. It reaches into the past and poisons the real ones. It takes every honest memory and refiles it under suspicion, until the person holding those memories can no longer tell which version came first, the truth they lived, or the lie someone told them about it. A lie doesn't need to be believable to everyone. It only needs to be believable to the one person whose wound it was designed to fit. If that just hit you somewhere real, leave a like on this video, and keep watching, because what Odessa does next will change everything. October 14th, 8:47 p.m. Now you know what she didn't. When Odessa stood in the bedroom doorway and watched Ren pull her suitcase from the top of the closet, she didn't know about Perry's phone call. She didn't know about the 11 minutes. She didn't know that the man standing in front of her, the one pulling her clothes from hangers with mechanical, tight-jawed efficiency, the one who wouldn't look at her, had spent the last 2 hours and 33 minutes dismantling every memory of their marriage and rebuilding it as evidence of fraud. She knew something was wrong the moment she came downstairs. He was standing in the living room with his back to her, and the posture was different, not angry, not cold, but sealed. The way a building looks after the windows have been boarded. Still standing, but closed for good. "Ren, what happened?" He didn't turn around. "I need you to pack a bag." "What are you talking about?" "I need you to pack a bag or I'll do it for you." She stood there, one hand on the banister, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach where their child had been turning somersaults all afternoon, and searched for the version of her husband she recognized inside this stranger's voice. She couldn't find him. "Look at me," she said. He didn't. He walked past her, up the stairs, and she heard the closet door open. She heard the suitcase land on the bed. She heard hangers sliding along the rod, one after another, with the rhythmic indifference of someone performing a task they've already committed to beyond the point of reconsideration. She followed him up. He was folding her clothes, not carefully, not the way he usually handled her things, but quickly, pressing them flat into the suitcase with both palms as if compressing something he needed to make smaller. Controllable. Gone. "Ren, stop. Tell me what's going on." He zipped the suitcase, lifted it off the bed, walked past her again, close enough that she could smell the sweat on him, the sour edge of adrenaline metabolizing through skin, and carried it down the stairs without a word. She followed him to the front door. He set the suitcase on the porch. Then he turned and looked at her for the first time since she'd come downstairs, and his face held an expression she had never seen on him before. Not fury, not grief, but the flat, demolished blankness of a man who has already convicted someone and is now simply carrying out the sentence. "Ren, don't." The door closed. The lock turned. The mechanical click that you heard at the beginning of this story, that small definitive sound that carried the weight of everything that came before it. And Odessa Fontaine Callister stood on the porch she had rebuilt with her own hands and felt the October air settle against her arms and understood, with the clarity of a structural engineer assessing catastrophic failure, that the foundation had just given way beneath her. She didn't pound on the door. She didn't scream. She stood very still for a long moment, breathing, one hand pressed flat against her stomach. Then she reached down, righted the suitcase that had toppled on the steps, and began walking. The streetlight at the end of Harmon Lane was the only one still working. The rest had been out since a transformer blew in August, and the city hadn't sent anyone to repair them. She walked toward it because it was the only lit thing in her field of vision, and when she reached it, she stopped and looked down at her shadow on the wet pavement. Stretched, distorted, wrong. She thought about the first time Ren said her name. Odessa. the way he'd held the syllables in his mouth like something borrowed that he intended to return in better condition. The man who had earned the right to say that name correctly had just used it, or refused to use it, to put her outside. She called a cab from her phone. The dispatcher said 12 minutes. She sat on her suitcase under the streetlight and waited, and the baby moved inside her, a slow rolling pressure beneath her ribs like a fist deciding whether to open or close. The cab took her 2 miles to the Sunoco station on Route 9 because that was as far as the $18 in her wallet would carry her. She sat in the parking lot on a concrete curb near the air pump, her suitcase beside her like a patient, useless companion, and her phone lit up with 15 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. She didn't call anyone. The people who would have come without question, her father, her grandmother, were both in St. Adalbert's Cemetery. The friends she'd had before the marriage had thinned out the way friendships do when your schedule becomes someone else's calendar. She was alone in the specific way that only a person who has organized her entire life around another person can be alone, thoroughly, structurally, without redundancy. The baby moved again. Harder this time, a pressure that didn't release. She pressed her palm flat against it and whispered, "I know, I know." Then the cramp came, low and tight, spreading across her abdomen like a belt being cinched. She breathed through it. It passed. Another one came 4 minutes later. She called Dr. Lozano's after-hours line. 2 miles away, Ren Callister was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the dishwasher and a bottle of bourbon on the tile beside him, half empty. The kitchen was dark. He hadn't turned on the lights. The only illumination came from his phone screen, still showing Perry's name in the recent calls, 6:14 p.m., duration 11 minutes, glowing with the quiet persistence of a detonator that has already done its work. His phone rang. Not Perry. The number belonged to Dr. Lozano's after-hours service. "Mr. Callister, this is Dr. Lozano's office. Your wife called from a gas station on Route 9. She's experiencing contractions and her blood pressure is elevated. We need her at Mercy General. She listed you as her emergency contact and primary support person. Can you confirm you'll be transporting her?" Contractions. The word landed in his chest like a blunt object. 11 weeks. She was 11 weeks along. Contractions at 11 weeks didn't mean labor. They meant distress. They meant the body was responding to something it couldn't sustain. They meant the baby, his baby, regardless of what Perry had said, regardless of what he had believed, the word is returning now with a force that cut through the bourbon and the self-pity and the wreckage of the last 3 hours. Where on Route 9? The Sunoco station near the Grayfield exit. He was in the car in 40 seconds. He didn't put on shoes. He didn't turn off the kitchen light he'd never turned on. He drove the 12-minute route in 7, running 2 stop signs and a light that had been red for a full second before he crossed it, and his mind did the thing it always did under pressure, split into 2 tracks, both running at once, neither one yielding to the other. Track 1, she lied. The baby isn't yours. Perry has known you for 16 years. Perry has no reason to lie about this. Track 2, you put a pregnant woman on the street. You didn't ask her a single question. You didn't let her speak. You locked the door and now she's at a gas station and something is wrong with the baby, your baby, because it is your baby. It has always been your baby. When has she ever given you a single reason? The tracks didn't resolve. They just ran, parallel, relentless, contradicting each other with equal conviction while his hands shook on the wheel. He pulled into the Sunoco lot and saw her immediately. She was sitting on the curb near the air pump. The overhead lights cast everything in that flat commercial white that makes the world look like a waiting room. Her suitcase stood upright beside her. Her hands were folded over her stomach. He got out of the car, stood 10 feet away, looked at her. She looked back. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gas station hummed around them, compressors, coolers, the mechanical indifference of a place built for transactions, not for the worst night of someone's life. "I called Dr. Lozano," Odessa said. Her voice was steady, not cold, steady. The voice of a woman who had learned, long before Ren ever entered her life, how to hold herself upright when everything beneath her was failing. She said, "I need to go to Mercy General." "I know, I'm here." "Why?" The question sat between them, simple, enormous, unanswerable in any way that would have been adequate. Why are you here? Not, why did you lock the door? Not, why did you believe whoever fed you whatever they fed you? Just, why are you here now, and what does your presence mean when your absence is the reason I'm sitting on this curb? "Because you're..." he stopped. His throat closed around the sentence. He started again. Because something's wrong, and Get me to the hospital, Ren. We can do this later. He picked up her suitcase, opened the passenger door, stood aside while she lowered herself into the seat, one hand braced against the doorframe. He didn't touch her. Not her arm, not her shoulder, not the small of her back. Because he understood, with a precision that cut through everything else, through the bourbon and the fear and the noise in his skull, that he had forfeited the right to. Put his hands on her approximately 2 hours and 13 minutes ago, and that understanding was the first honest thing his mind had produced since Perry Barlow's phone call. He drove without shoes. She directed without tears. And between them, a heartbeat held on, small, fast, indifferent to the catastrophe above it, concerned only with the ancient, uncomplicated work of surviving. What happens inside that hospital will define whether this family lives or dies. Stay with this. October 14th, 10:40, 1 p.m. Under the corridor lights of Mercy General Hospital, Dr. Lozano delivered her assessment in the clinical, measured language of a physician who understands that precision is its own form of kindness. Stress-induced contractions, blood pressure at 158/102, dangerously elevated for any patient, critically so for a woman in her first trimester. The baby was stable. The heartbeat was strong, but the situation was volatile, and Odessa would need to be monitored overnight, possibly longer, depending on whether her body could be convinced to step down from the emergency it had declared in response to the one her husband had created. Dr. Lozano did not say that last part. She didn't need to. The math was self-evident. Ren sat in the hallway outside the room. The floor was cold through his socks. He still wasn't wearing shoes, and the absurdity of that detail registered somewhere in the back of his awareness without fully arriving. A man in a hospital hallway at nearly 11 o'clock at night, no shoes, bourbon still faintly on his breath, sitting beneath lights that buzzed with the same indifferent hum as the ones at the gas station. As if the entire world had agreed to illuminate his failures in the same flat commercial frequency, he pulled out his phone. Called Perry. Perry answered on the second ring, as if he'd been sitting with the phone in his hand, as if he'd been waiting. "The man at the clinic," Ren said. His voice had gone very quiet, not the quiet of calm, but the quiet that exists in the space between detonation and collapse. The kind of quiet people step back from. "Describe him." "Ren, I already told you." "Describe him." A pause. Then Perry recited it, the version he'd constructed, the description he'd assembled from nothing and dressed in enough detail to pass his memory. Tall, dark hair. They were walking close together. His arm was around her. Ren closed his eyes. Nico Reyes was 5 feet 6 inches tall. He was bald, completely, conspicuously, had been bald for 15 years bald. He walked with a cane on bad days and a pronounced limp on good ones. And his arm had not been around Odessa. Odessa's arm had been around him, steadying a 63-year-old man with a deteriorating knee on cracked pavement outside a building that had never once invested in maintaining its parking lot. Tall, dark hair, arm around her. 3 details. Every one of them wrong. Not approximately wrong, completely, structurally, foundationally wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't come from misremembering. The kind that only comes from invention. "You're lying," Ren said. Silence. "Perry, you made it up. Every word. All of it." More silence. Then, very softly, with a kind of anguish that might have been genuine or might have been the final performance of a man who had been performing for years, Perry said, I thought you deserved to know." "Know what? Something that never happened? Something you built out of nothing because... Why, Perry? Why?" The line went dead. Ren sat in that hallway for a long time. The phone rested on his thigh, screen dark. He thought about his father, about the checks on the 15th, about the window he used to stand beside on Saturday mornings, watching for a car that never came, about how, at some point between childhood and this hallway, the waiting had hardened into expectation, and the expectation had become a lens he couldn't remove, one that turned every act of love into a prelude to abandonment. He had spent his whole life afraid of being the one who was left, and in his fear, he had become the one who leaves. He stood, walked to the door of her room, knocked. She didn't say come in. She didn't say go away. The silence sat between those 2 instructions like a border checkpoint with no guard, technically passable, but at your own risk. He opened the door. She was lying on her side, facing the window. The The monitors beside the bed beeped in steady intervals, mechanical, patient, unconcerned. The 4 dripped. The screen above the headboard displayed the baby's heartbeat, 160 beats per minute. Strong, consistent, utterly indifferent to the devastation of its parents. "It was Perry," Wren said from the doorway. "He called me at 6. He said he saw you at the clinic on Broad Street with a man. He said the baby wasn't mine." Odessa didn't turn from the window. "And you believed him?" It wasn't a question. It was a measurement. The precise calculation of exactly how much weight the structure had failed to hold. "Yes." "Over me?" "Yes." She was quiet. The monitors filled the space between them with their patient, repetitive certainty, the only honest sound in the room. "Nico drove me to my prenatal appointment," she said. "My car was in the shop. His knee was bad, and I held his arm across the parking lot because the pavement was uneven. I told you about it that night on the phone. I told you about the heartbeat. I told you Nico cried." Wren remembered. Every word, the warmth in her voice, the way she'd described the ultrasound image, like a comma with ambitions. Nico's tears. "Next time, I promise." The memory returned to him now with its original clarity, clean and whole, and its presence inside him alongside what he had done with it felt like holding something precious in the same hand that had just smashed it. "I know," he said. "You didn't ask me, Wren." She still hadn't turned. Her voice was steady, not cold, not performatively calm, but controlled with the same precision she brought to every calculation she'd ever made. Every word placed with the intentionality of someone who understands that language like lumber either bears weight or it doesn't. "You didn't let me speak. You packed my suitcase and you opened the door and you put me outside like I was something that needed removing." He stood in the doorway and received every word, not because he was brave, because she was right, and receiving it was the minimum of what the moment required. "I've spent my entire life," she said, and here, for the first time, the steady architecture of her composure fractured. A single crack running through the center of her voice like a fissure through a foundation wall, earning trust. My father's trust when he was alive, the trust of every person who walks into that store, your trust. And you handed all of it to Perry Barlow on a phone call, like it was nothing, like 3 years of me showing up every single day, every morning, every evening, every moment I chose you, meant less than 11 minutes of someone else's words. She turned then. Her eyes were dry, but her face held the kind of devastation that exists beyond the reach of tears. The flat, level geography of a person who has just watched something she built with her own hands be demolished by someone else's carelessness. "I don't know how to forgive this," she said. "I want you to understand that clearly. I don't know if I can." "I know. I need you to leave the room now." He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, quieter than the one on Harmon Lane, but carrying the same weight. And Wren Callister stood in a hospital corridor in his socks and understood, with the kind of clarity that arrives only after you've destroyed the thing you were trying to protect. That trust is not a single moment. It is the accumulated mass of every day someone decided to show up. Every morning, every evening, every ordinary hour in which a person chose, without applause and without recognition, to remain. And when you discard that weight, when you trade it for the word of someone who never carried a single pound of it, you don't just break trust. You insult the entire architecture of what someone built beside you. What came after? This is not the part of the story where a single apology repairs everything. This is not the scene where he arrives with flowers and she falls into his arms and the music builds and the screen fades to black on two people who have been made whole by one well-timed gesture. That version of reconciliation belongs to stories written by people who have never had to reconstruct trust from the ground up, one agonizing, unglamorous plank at a time. Here is what actually happened. Odessa stayed with Nico and Bertil Reyes for 3 weeks. Their guest room smelled like Bertil's lavender sachets and the faint, permanent residue of whatever Nico had been cooking that morning, because Nico cooked the way other men watch television, constantly, without plan, as a default state of being. The bed was too soft. The walls were thin enough to hear Bertil's late-night phone conversations with her sister in Montreal, conducted in rapid Haitian Creole at a volume that suggested Bertil believed international calls required shouting. It was not comfortable. It was safe. And for 3 weeks, safe was the only specification that mattered. Wren did not contest the arrangement. He did not show up at Nico's door uninvited. He did not flood Odessa's phone with paragraph-length confessions or pleas dressed as apologies. He sent one text per day, short, specific, stripped of self-pity, and scrubbed of anything that could be mistaken for an attempt to make his pain the subject of her attention. Dr. Lozano's office confirmed your Thursday appointment. I can drive you or arrange a car, whatever you prefer. The furnace filter needed changing. I changed it. The house is warm. Nico mentioned your car is ready at the shop. I can pick it up if that's easier. She didn't respond to most of them. He kept sending them anyway. Not because he expected responses, because the texts weren't requests, they were proof of attendance. Evidence that he was still showing up for the invisible labor, even when the person he'd been showing up for had every right to stop watching. He started therapy the second week, not because Odessa asked, not because anyone suggested it, because he sat on that kitchen floor the night she left, bourbon-soaked, shoeless, surrounded by the quiet of a house that had been full 2 hours earlier, and understood something he'd been circling for 31 years without ever looking at directly. The thing inside him that had believed Perry's lie was older than Perry, older than Odessa, older than the marriage. It was the inheritance his father had left behind, not money, not property, not letters, but the quiet cellular conviction that love was a temporary condition, that the people who stayed were simply the ones who hadn't yet identified which door led out. That trust was not something to build on. It was something to survive. He told the therapist about the checks on the 15th, about the window on Saturday mornings, about the way waiting for someone who never arrives eventually becomes indistinguishable from expecting someone who always leaves. He said things out loud in that office that he had never spoken to anyone, not Perry, not Odessa, not the bourbon, and each one left his mouth feeling like a splinter being pulled from a wound that had closed around it years ago. Meanwhile, Odessa did not hold still. She reopened the hardware store's accounting books and found the discrepancy she'd been too exhausted to chase for months, a supplier billing error that had been quietly overcharging them for 14 weeks. She filed the correction, recovered the funds, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem solved through precision rather than emotion. She called Patrice Okoro, her college roommate, her closest friend from a life that predated Ren, for the first time in 2 years. They talked for 4 hours. Patrice didn't offer advice. She offered presence, which was better. She went to her prenatal appointments alone, watched the baby grow on the screen, the comma with ambitions becoming something with limbs, with a profile, with what the technician called a strong opinion about personal space based on the way she kept kicking during measurements. When the technician asked if she wanted to know the sex, Odessa said yes, immediately without hesitation, because she was finished waiting for other people to be ready for information she needed. A girl. She didn't tell Ren. Not yet. That knowledge belonged to her for a while, a private, quiet possession that no one else had a claim on. He found out 5 weeks later, not from Odessa. Bertil told the entire neighborhood within 48 hours of learning, because Bertil Reyes treated confidential information the way a colander treats water. It passed through her in every direction regardless of effort. They met at the diner on Prospect Avenue. Neutral ground. Bad coffee. Good pie. A table by the window where the late autumn light fell across the laminate surface in long amber rectangles. Ren didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't explain himself. He said, "I broke something. I know that, and I want to spend whatever time you'll give me learning how to be someone who doesn't break things. Not just for you, yes for you, but because I don't want to carry my father's version of love into my daughter's life." Odessa looked at him across the table for a long moment. Then, "You know it's a girl?" Nico told Bertil. Bertil told Mrs. Kowalski. Mrs. Kowalski congratulated me at the gas station. I think the mail carrier also knows. Despite everything, despite October, despite the porch, despite the suitcase and the gas station and the hospital and the weeks of silence, Odessa laughed. Short and surprised, it came out of her like something that had been held under pressure and finally found a seam to escape through. "Bertil cannot keep a secret to save her life," she said. "No," Ren agreed. "She absolutely cannot." They sat there, not touching, not reconciled, not destroyed, somewhere between the two, somewhere honest and unfinished and real. April. A Tuesday. Colette Fontaine Callister was born during a week when the dogwoods along Harmon Lane bloomed so aggressively that the petals covered the sidewalks like confetti from a celebration nobody had organized. Ren was in the delivery room. Odessa had invited him, not as absolution, not as a declaration that the damage was repaired, but as a deliberate decision about the kind of beginning she wanted for her daughter. Both parents present, not for his sake, for Colette's. He held his daughter for the first time and felt something rearrange itself behind his ribs. Not the cinematic version of fatherhood, not the instant tears, not the swelling score. Something quieter. The same slow, structural certainty he'd felt years ago, lying in sawdust under a porch while a woman he didn't know yet explained why foundations matter more than facades. This is what holds everything up. This is what you don't let rot. Odessa moved back into the house on Harmon Lane 6 weeks after Colette was born. She didn't announce it. There was no ceremony, no declaration, no turning point that could be marked with a date and circled on a calendar. She came over one Saturday to drop off the baby for Wren's afternoon and stayed for dinner. Then stayed for the evening. Then her suitcase appeared in the bedroom closet, upright, standing in the corner, where it belonged. They were not the same two people who had stood on opposite sides of that door in October. They were not supposed to be. The foundation had cracked, and they had chosen, not in a single heroic moment but in 100 small, unremarkable decisions spread across months, to rebuild it. With better materials, with more honest engineering, with the understanding that what broke once can be made stronger than what was never tested. Wren never spoke to Perry Barlow again. He didn't deliver a cathartic speech. He didn't seek confrontation. He simply removed Perry from his life the way you remove a compromised beam, completely without ceremony, with the clear understanding that leaving it in place would only threaten everything around it. One evening, the porch. Colette was asleep. The house was quiet in the specific way a house is quiet, when a baby has finally stopped resisting consciousness, grateful, cautious, slightly disbelieving. They sat on the porch, the one Wren had repaired with Odessa's guidance 4 years earlier, before they were married, before Colette, before October. The wood was holding. The joists were sound. The treated pine she'd insisted on, cost more up front, lasts 3 times as long, had done exactly what she'd promised it would. I still think about October, Odessa said. I know, Wren said. I do too. Not the way you think. I think about walking to that streetlight and looking down at my reflection on the wet pavement. It was stretched out, distorted. It didn't look like me. She paused. And I remember thinking, that's not what I look like. That's not who I am. And I think that was the moment I knew I'd be okay, even if we weren't. Wren looked at her. The porch light was behind her, and her face was half in shadow, and she was, as she had always been, the most precise person he had ever known. Precise in her language, precise in her generosity, precise in the boundaries she drew and the trust she rebuilt, one board at a time. I'm sorry, he said. He had said it before. He would say it again, not because the words needed repeating, but because the truth of them never weighed less. I know you are, she said. She leaned into him, slightly, just her shoulder against his. The smallest gesture a human body can make toward another, a degree of contact so minor it would be invisible to anyone standing more than 3 feet away. It held more weight than any vow either of them had ever spoken. The porch held. The joists held. The house they had built, board by board, argument by argument, mistake by painful, honest reckoning, held. Sometimes that's the whole story. Not the falling, not the breaking, the holding. If this story reminded you that love isn't proven in the easy moments, it's proven in the ones that should have ended it, share this with someone who needs to hear that rebuilding is possible. Subscribe to Marble Heart for more stories that stay with you long after they end.